In this video, I'm going to develop the proxy material that I created earlier on into the final cliff material. So I'm going to come back to our contents browser and open up the cliff material. So this is the proxy material that I created earlier on. In my material, I have use material attributes checked. And then I have a make material attributes, which is creating the material for the grass. And then I have another material here for the rock. And I'm blending together three different colors. I have the base cliff color, followed by three different colors here, one for the convexity, concavity, and ambient occlusion mask that I have stored on the vertex color. And I'm using that vertex color to blend between these different colors, and then piping that into the base color on this make material attributes. And then I'm blending between those two materials using a vertex normal world space, which gives me this mask, and then using a smooth step to adjust that blend. Then finally blend those two materials together. So now I'm going to bring in some textures and build up some extra functionality for the material instance. Let's just give us plenty of space and move the grass material up here, and then just bring these guys over here. Just giving us a bit more space as I start to develop this material. I'm going to start with the grass material. I no longer need this color, so let's delete that. And I'm going to come to my contents browser and into the Megascans library, where I've downloaded several different textures. I'm going to find one to use for the grass. And I have a mossy ground texture here that I've been using. You can find the same texture by searching the Megascans library for this code here. And you can download all of these textures from the Quixel bridge. So if I just search for that code, TE4EFHEL, that'll take you straight to this mossy ground grass texture that I used. So I'm going to add these textures to my material, line these up nice and tidy. And I'm not using UVs on my cliffs. Instead, I'm going to use triplanar texturing, and this will project the textures onto the surface in world space. I can do that using a world aligned texture. If you look closely, you can see it says texture object, whereas these are texture sample. So I'm going to right click on my texture sample and convert to texture object. Now these are texture objects. I also want it to be a parameter, so I'm going to right click on the texture object and then click convert to parameter. So now this is a texture object parameter, and I'm going to attach that to the first input on the world aligned texture. And I'm going to do the same for the next two texture samples. So let's copy and paste this world aligned texture, and then convert them to texture objects and then to a parameter. And connect them to the first input on the world aligned textures. Let's give these a name and call it 01 base color. Next one's going to be 01 normal, and then finally 01 ORDP, because this is a texture packed occlusion, roughness, and displacement. Actually, I need to change this world aligned texture. For the normal, I'm going to add a world aligned normal, which is specifically for the normal map. and I need to specify a texture size. So to do that, I'm going to add a vector node. Set the red, green and blue channel to 1, so it's white. Because we're working at such a large scale with our cliffs, I'm going to multiply this by 100. And then attach this to another multiply, and on the B channel, right click, promote to parameter, and call this map tiling, and set the default to 10. And now attach this multiply to the texture size on our 3 world aligned textures. So we have our textures set up, but I want to add some parameters so I can have some control over these textures. So to make some parameters, I'm going to hold S on my keyboard for scalar parameter and left click in the viewport. I'm going to add 4 scalar parameters. The first I'm going to call base color saturation. Second one I'm going to call base color contrast. Second one, base color hue. And the final one, base color brightness. From the base color saturation, I'm going to add a 1 minus, and then attach this to a desaturation node. Actually, I want this to be connected to the second input, which is the fraction. Because I'm using the 1 minus to invert this saturation value, this actually becomes a value that controls the saturation rather than the desaturation. So I'm going to leave this as a value of 1, and then as I reduce this number, it would desaturate the base color. Next, I'm going to add a cheap contrast, followed by a hue shift. And then last of all, hold M on the keyboard and left click in the graph to add a multiply. So I'm going to add the XYZ texture from the world line texture to the first input on the desaturation, and then connect the desaturation to the cheap contrast. Attach the base color contrast parameter to the contrast, and then connect the cheap contrast to the hue, connect up the hue parameter, and then finally the hue shift to the multiply and the base color brightness to the second input on the multiply. We set some default values. So for the base color contrast, default will be 1. I'm going to leave the default values for base color contrast and hue to 0, and make base color brightness a default value of 1. And now I can connect this multiply to the base color. I'm going to add some min and max values to these parameters. So the max on the brightness is going to be 2. Base color hue, the max is going to be 1. Cheap contrast is going to go between a min value of -1 and max 1. And the color saturation, I'm going to add a max of 2. If I have a quick look at my parameters tab, you can see these parameters that I've added. Currently they're all grouped together, so let's just organize these a little bit. I'm going to select all of these textures. Under the group, I'm going to type 1 maps, and then select all of my parameters, and for the group, type 1 parameters. And take a look at the parameters tab, and now these are grouped together in their own collapsible sections. Let's just give this a save. Next, for the normal, I'm going to take the XYZ texture and attach this to a flatten normal. Let's add another scalar parameter, holding S on the keyboard and clicking in the graph. This currently controls the flatness, so the higher the value, the flatter the normal will be. I want to invert this. So now that I've inverted this, this parameter will control how strong this normal is rather than how flat it is. Let's add a default of 1, and I'm going to do a max value of 5. Let's connect that to the normal on the make attributes. And finally, I want the roughness. So connect the XYZ to a component mask. ORDP for occlusion, roughness, and displacement indicate the order in which these channels are packed. So roughness is on the green channel because it's in the center. And let's connect this to a multiply. Add another scalar parameter. This one is going to be called roughness intensity. Default value of 1, let's connect this to the second input on the multiply, and set a max value of 2. Let's also name this parameter as well. So this one is called normal intensity. And let's put these under the same group as the others. So parameters. Let's double check these are looking good. And connect this to the roughness on the make attributes. Let's just move these a bit so they're all a bit clearer. Give ourselves plenty of space. So now that I've saved that, let's have a quick look at our scene. Something's not quite right. The grass is currently black, so let's have a look and see what's going on. And here I can see this cheap contrast, the input is for a scalar, but we're using a color texture. So let's delete this cheap contrast, and I'm going to add an RGB cheap contrast, which is for color, and connect this contrast back to the hue. And the second thing I need to fix is this hue shift. I've connected the texture to the hue shift percentage and the parameter to the texture. So let's swap these around. There we go, now our texture, I can see it there on our preview. So I'm going to save this and come back to our scene. There we go, now I'm seeing the grass on our cliff. So that's working nicely. And what I can do is actually copy this whole network for this first material. Bring that down here and paste it down here. And let's connect this up to this blend material attributes. And now I can delete this previous one from down here. So now these textures and parameters are going to be for the cliff. So let's rename them. I can now call these 0, 2, because these are for the second material, which is for the cliff. And do the same for our parameters. Make sure you get them all. So that's all the parameters for the base color, normal intensity, roughness intensity, and the 3 texture objects. You can always double check this in the parameters. There you go, I can see them all renamed there, but I want to update the groups. So let's select all of the texture objects and rename these to two maps and the parameters. Select all of those and rename this to two parameters. There we go. I now have a group for the first textures, the first parameters, the second map, and its accompanying parameters. That's all nice and neat. Now we can update these textures. So I'm going to come back to the contents browser and come to one of my cliff textures. I'm going to use these textures here. So let's just get these side by side and drag and drop these textures into these texture objects to update them. So now I have these three textures updated to the cliff texture and all of the parameters updated. And I can see that in the viewport. So I'm going to hit save and then check that out in the scene. And now I have a cliff texture. Let's get a little closer. I need to set the tiling on this cliff texture because currently it's not tiled correctly. So let's also attach this multiply to the texture size on these world align textures for the cliff texture. So that's now connected to all 6 of my texture objects, and I can see that's now scaled up correctly. The next thing I'm going to change is this blend. Currently I'm using Vertex normal world space, which is okay, but I want the normal map to influence that blending, because currently it's very smooth. So I'm going to come over to our normal for our cliff, and drag off the XYZ texture, and I'm going to add a transform. And if I preview this node, you can see this is doing something similar to that Vertex normal world space. And I've converted the normal map that is in tangent space into world space. Stop previewing that and attach this to this mask. If I preview that, you can see I've got the upward facing mask, but it's influenced by the normal map. I can delete that Vertex world normal space, stop previewing, and there you can see now I've got a more interesting blend between the two materials. Let's promote these min and max of this smooth step to parameters. Let's call this blend min and blend max. And put these under a group called 0 parameters. Just call these common parameters. And take a look. There we've got these common parameters now. Let's make these a default value of 0.6 and 0.8. And I'm also going to add this map tiling as a parameter under the common parameters. So now we have those together. Just realised I'm using a different naming convention for the maps and the parameters. So let's also update these to keep these nice and consistent. Always pays to be organised. And do the same for the grass textures. So this is coming along nicely. The last thing I want to do is incorporate these colours for our vertex colour masks. So if I just give us some more space, move these lerps across, and come up to our base colour, I'm going to take the multiply, which is coming from our base colour for our cliff, and bring that all the way down and attach this to the A input on the first lerp. And now attach this last lerp to the base colour for our cliff. Currently I have no vertex color on this sphere, so it's going to look odd in the viewport here, but if I save this and come back to the viewport, now the textures are looking correct, but I'm not seeing any of that vertex color. If I just do a quick preview and attach this vertex color to the base color on the make material attributes for the cliff, we can see in the material it's white. If I look in the viewport here, you can see on this cliff I have got that vertex color. So I want to add some parameters to strengthen these masks so we can more clearly see those masks. What I can do to make things a bit easier to work with, to preview in the material, is select one of these cliff sections, come down to the static mesh component, and then find the static mesh and hit this folder icon to find it in the contents browser. Then, with it selected, come back to the material and click this little kind of brick icon on the far right, and that will bring the static mesh into the viewport. If I hit F, I'll focus on it, and there I can now see I've got that cliff previewed in my material. It's very big, so it might be a little tricky to navigate. Bring that material down here and reconnect this lerp. So now I'm going to add some parameters for our vertex color. So I'm going to drop down some more scalar parameters, holding S and just clicking in the viewport. And I'm going to add 4 parameters. And we're going to call this first one Convexity Power. Second one, Convexity Multiply. Convexity Contrast. And the last one, Convexity Opacity. So let's add some nodes. Let's add a power. I'm going to add a multiply. A cheap contrast. And then finally another multiply. And connect these up. So convexity power to the exponent, convexity multiply to the second input on the multiply, the convexity contrast to contrast, and then the opacity to the second input on the multiply. And then hook these up. So I'm going to take the red channel from our vertex color, add that to the power, power to the multiply, multiply to the input on the cheap contrast, and finally the cheap contrast to the multiply. And now I'm going to connect this with the rest of the graph. So if I just come up here and have a look, I don't need this first color because that was the base color. I'm going to delete that. And now I have the color for the convexity, concavity, and ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion is currently last, so it's layered on top of these 2 colors for the convexity and concavity. I want to reorder that so that the ambient occlusion is the first color. So I'm just going to disconnect this lerp here for the ambient occlusion, and holding Control and clicking on a wire, I can drag it and reconnect it. So now the color for the concavity is going straight into the base color on the make materials attribute, and I'm going to bring this color and its lerp up to the top, and now reconnect this input, again holding Control and left clicking and connecting that wire to the first lerp. Now I can reconnect that wire for the ambient occlusion lerp into the lerp for the convexity. So just to make sure that this is all correct, we have the ambient occlusion, which is using the blue channel of the vertex color, which is being inverted, and then that's the alpha for this first lerp. For the second lerp, I am taking the red channel of the vertex color, and that's connected to the alpha for the second lerp. And then finally, the green channel is connected to the alpha for the third lerp. And then that's been connected to the base color of the make material attributes. Now I'm going to bring up these parameters we just made to where we have the convexity color. Let's give us a bit more space. Now I'm just going to tidy up these wires a little bit. Let's bring the vertex color up here. So this is for the ambient occlusion mask from the blue channel. We have the red channel for the vertex color that's coming into this power node. And now I'm going to connect this multiply to the alpha on the second lerp. And if we come and now look up at our geometry in the viewport, and then let's now adjust these values, because currently we can't see anything in the viewport. So I'm going to increase the convexity power to 1, set the convexity multiplier to 1 as well, set the convexity contrast to 0.1, and the opacity, and I'm going to set the opacity to 1 as well. Might be a little bit subtle at the moment, so I'm going to change it from lit to unlit. And now you might just see we've got some white areas appear. I'm going to reduce the convexity power to 0.5. There we go, that's looking a little bit stronger now. You can start to see that start to stand out. Let's increase the multiplier to 2. And that's made that really strong, so you can really see that starting to have an effect. So these parameters will give me some controls over the look and feel of these masks. Now I can just copy and paste these for the remaining masks. So let's first do the ambient occlusion. I'm going to copy, paste, move these up here, connect the 1 minus to the power, and then come back over to the multiply, and then connect that to the alpha for the lerp. And now I can rename these. So this is occlusion power, occlusion multiplier, occlusion contrast, and occlusion opacity. Let's go back to unlit. And again, let's turn up this multiplier for the occlusion to say 2. Maybe bring this occlusion power to 0.2, maybe a bit too much, 0.4. Again, it's quite strong, but I just want to show that it's working and having an effect. And that occlusion really kind of gives some depth to these rocks. So you can see it kind of outlining all the cracks. And it really gives it a lot of depth. And then finally the colour for the concavity. So let's copy these convexity parameters again, paste those and bring them down here. And now I'm taking the green channel from the vertex colour and connecting that to the power. And then connecting that multiply again to the alpha on the final lerp. Move these down a little bit. Keeping everything nice and tidy and lined up. And now we can rename these parameters. This is concavity power, concavity multiplier, concavity contrast, and then concavity opacity. Just going to change down the opacity for the occlusion to 0 for now, just to make it easier to see this concavity colour whilst I adjust it. Let's bring up the concavity multiplier to 2. Because this is the concavity, the concave areas of the mesh, it will occupy some of the areas that the ambient occlusion mask cover, but the ambient occlusion will kind of be much broader in kind of the more shaded areas of the rock. So you can kind of dial these into taste. Let's bring down the concavity opacity to 0.5, 0.6, and I'll leave the convexity opacity at 1. Now we can save this and take a look at our map. And there we can see that vertex color and the masks on the cliffs. And so from a distance, these really just help give some depth and help pick out the shapes of the cliffs. And again, maybe this could be a little more subtle, but I just wanted to show clearly kind of how it works, and you can change it and adjust it however you need. Now let's come back to the material and take a look at our parameters. I need to put these parameters I've just made into a group. So I'm going to select all of the occlusion parameters. So selecting all of the occlusion nodes, I'm going to put these into a group called 3 occlusion, and then 3 convexity for the convexity, and then place the concavity parameters into a group called 3 concavity. And now let's have a look at the parameters, and I can scroll down, and okay, now I have those parameters grouped together. I also want to make these color nodes into parameters as well. So I'm going to right click, convert to parameter on each one of these nodes. And the first one is going to be called occlusion color. Second one is called convexity color. And then finally concavity color. And I'm going to select all of them and put them in a group called 3 color. And take a look at the parameters. So if we scroll down, you can see we've got color up here first, then followed by all of the parameters. So now I have all of those parameters available from within the material instance, which make it really easy to come in and customize this material and make changes and kind of dial in these values as I need to. So this gives a really nice level of control and flexibility to these materials. Next thing I want to do is add some blending between the cliffs and the materials on the landscape. With the landscape material that George created during his landscape series, he utilized virtual texturing. So I can use that to blend between the materials on the landscape and the materials on the cliff. So let's take a look at that now. Going back to the material on the cliffs, and come back up to this blend material attributes, where it's blending between the cliff, rock, and the grass. And I'm going to add in another blend material attributes. So let's add that blend material attributes and another make material attributes. And I'm going to attach the output of the first blend material attributes into the first input on the newly created blend material attributes and connect this material attributes to the second. And so I'm going to build here using the virtual texture, the landscape material. So add a runtime virtual texture sample and connect the base color to the base color on the make material attributes, followed by the roughness. And connect the blend material attributes to the material attributes on the output for the material. And now on the runtime virtual texture sample, I want to select the virtual texture. I'm not going to go in detail on how to set up a runtime virtual texture with the landscape. I'm just going to cover how I kind of used it to blend between the cliffs and the landscape. So next I need an alpha to blend between the material and this virtual texture. To do that, I'm going to add another runtime virtual texture sample. And this time, the texture will be the height. And along with the world position. What I'm going to do is subtract the Z position. So let's add a subtract with the world height. So this will get the difference between the world height position of the landscape and the position of our cliffs. And then I can use that as a blend between the two. So if I connect this to a smooth step, I want this subtract to be connected to the value and then promote the min and the max. And I'm going to call this VT for virtual texture, blend min, and VT blend max. Then connect this smooth step to the alpha on this blend material attributes. I'm going to set just a default value of 0 and 1 for the blend min and max, and save that. And come take a look at our landscape. So it looks like I might have these the wrong way round on this blend material attributes. So let's just swap these around. So the runtime virtual texture is first, and then the material for our cliffs is the second input. And then put these parameters in the group for the common parameters. And let's hit save. And if we take a look at this material instance, we can adjust this blend. So let's increase this. And then we can start to see that landscape material blending onto the cliffs. Let's increase up the minimum a bit. And if we look from a distance, that can just help blend the landscape onto these cliffs so that it isn't quite so abrupt. So obviously you could take a bit more time to kind of dial these in and adjust that blending, maybe adjust how much this grass is appearing on top of the cliffs. But hopefully this gives you an idea of and help blend this kind of procedural geometry into the wider environment.